Welcome to all our listeners. Welcome to the local elections, economic recovery, fashion and coups d'etat episode of Ubuntunomics. With me this evening is Sbu from ICASA Assets. Hello Sbu, how are you doing this evening?
I'm fine, thank you, sir. I hope you are well your side too.
I'm very well, thank you. I can't complain. And with us this evening is Zama from M&M Legal. Hello Zama, how are you doing today?
Hi there. Yeah, well, thanks, and you? How you doing, Sue?
No, fine, thank you, Zama. Good to have you back.
Yes, good to have you back, Zama. I'm well as
Great
well.
to be back. Great to be back. Thank you.
All right, so let's get us started with the SA update from this week. Our first story is the IEC Prepares for elections. The Constitutional Court dismissed the Independent Electoral Commission IEC's application to postpone the upcoming local government elections until February 2021 due to safety concerns as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. The Court has ordered the IEC to hold elections on any day in the period from the 27th of October until the 1st of November 2021 to determine whether it can hold a voter registration weekend ahead of elections and to announce a revised election timetable. The IEC has since scheduled a registration weekend for the weekend of 18 and 19 September 2021. And the Minister of Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs is expected to announce the election date on the 20th of September and close the voters' roll for elections, as well as the IEC is expected to publish an amended election timetable. Currently, the IEC's view is that amending the timetable and reopening nominations is reasonably necessary in the current circumstances, despite different views as to whether this is permissible given the Concord order. Zama, you called this. I think just remind us of when you. I remember us vaguely having this discussion and wondering whether or not the Concord would grant the IEC's application.
Yes, and I think, guys, thank you for noting that. I really did call this, in terms of when we had this discussion. I think even Spoo would remember that in terms of the moving of the elections, and I think Spoo and I actually had differing views on this point. And I think I held to the fact that, I refuse for this election to be moved. So I guess maybe, I don't know if it's my legal training, but I'm not surprised at what the Concord did, because my feeling was that, honestly, if they had to move it, I think that would have actually impacted more on democracy, given the what we have been going through as a country with the pandemic. I think that we really do need to give people the opportunity to vote now and decide, and especially with our vaccination efforts going well. So from my side, I honestly celebrate this. And I think, let us all go to the polls and have a vote. But I did have a question around this, to say that I remember when we covered the story, we also noted that there would be online registration that the government has rolled out, for voting. So I wonder if actual voting, casting your ballot, can be done online, or is there a significance that's attached to actually voting, physically in person? Are there security concerns that are, maybe, highlighted, or are we just not technologically advanced at this point?
Sure, good question, I think. Look, I think even the issue of electronic voter machines is always looked at with skepticism, just mainly because it introduces an additional layer of a risk. For example, you might remember, I think it was the 2016 or 2017 Kenyan elections, which were initially actually interfered by hackers. And the Constitutional Court then set aside the elections and they had to rerun elections. So there's always a risk involved. I'm not sure, as to whether our systems in South Africa and IEC has the capacity to run, secure electronic voting. I'm not even sure there's any other country that does that, even though they might have electronic voting. I think the only kind of televoting I'm aware of is the US and the Postal Service, and allowing people to vote via post. So yeah,
That's interesting.
I don't think that the system is that advanced. They are, however, going to be using electronic registration booths during the registration weekend. But yeah, I'm a bit surprised by the Concord decision, and it seems to have really tied the hands of the IEC as well as that of political parties who are now trying to find a way around a contentious issue as to whether the Constitutional Court ruling allows for reopening of nominations. Smu, what are your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, well, I sensed a little bit of gloating there from Muzama. Okay, my sister.
Definitely.
Feels good to be right, huh?
One thing everyone will agree on is that these elections will be fiercely contested. I mean, the credibility of the IEC and the acceptance of the final election results in the end will also be on the line. I mean, South Africa does not want to go the way of Kenya or Zimbabwe, where the final arbiter was the courts instead of the voting booth being where people make their wishes known. Because if that happens, if we go the courts route, that'll lead to a lot of consternation. Sometimes, I hope not, I pray not, that there will be the spilling of blood, or because that will ultimately lead to a loss of trust on the electoral system itself. There are, however, two conflicting opinions on whether the current constitutional court order allows for the candidate registration or not. Because there's one view that says the constitutional court has not completely invalidated the election timetable. That it may actually be difficult to allow for candidate registration. And then there's another view that says that people will be registering anew, given that there will be an opportunity given for registration. I mean, what I'm trying to say is that candidates, because there were 94 candidates that didn't make it onto the list, and 74 more which got registered late by a party like the ANC. So those might come in through the back door, as the DA says. So the DA has already approached both the Electoral Court and the Constitutional Court, seeking another clarity or judgment about this matter of a candidate registration. So I think we'll be going to the courts, and I don't know how it will play out, but there's still these two views, these conflicting views. So yeah, we'll see.
But for me, it seems quite implicit in the order that the Constitutional Court has actually nullified the existing timetable by ordering the IEC to issue a new timetable. They would also then allow for a reopening of nominations. I don't know if I might just be understanding the law simply, though. But moving on to our next story from the SA update. Real gross domestic product GDP measured by production increased by 1.2% quarter on quarter in the second quarter of 2021, from a 1% increase in the first quarter. And measured by expenditure, GDP also increased by 1.2%, from an increase of 0.8% in the first quarter. The largest positive contributors to real GDP growth by production were transport, which grew by 6.9% and contributed 0.5% to GDP, personal services, which increased by 2.5%, contributing 0.4% to GDP, as well as trade, which increased by 2.2%, contributing 0.3% of GDP. And the largest positive contributors to growth by GDP, according to expenditure, came from exports, which increased by 4%, household consumption, which increased by 0.5%, and gross fixed capital formation, which increased by 0.9%. Production in the manufacturing industry, however, decreased by 0.8%, mainly due to decreased growth in 6 out of the 10 manufacturing subsectors. And government final consumption expenditure also decreased by 0.9%, mainly due to decreased government employment. Sbu, you had a very simple assertion on this one, and I actually wanted to pry and see what else you have in mind.
Yeah, I won't go into detail about the numbers and the sectors and the industries and all of that, but all I will say is that we simply have to stimulate the demand side of the equation and focus on the sectors that produce the biggest impact. Our main goal will be employment creation, not just enriching a slight minority which is invested in the stock markets. What we need here are counter-cyclical measures, and that's the only way out. Relying on the markets to sort themselves out is counterproductive at this stage, and it won't lead to growth. There's absolutely no reason why government consumption expenditure decreased while we are in a crisis. And our president keeps on talking about a 500 billion rand stimulus, but no, that was not. We have labored the point that the 200 billion rands of what was supposed to be a stimulus was just guarantees, and they were never taken up. And so we need to create aggregate demands here.
Definitely, I definitely agree with you. So my question though is how do we do this? You do say that we need to stimulate demand, but how exactly? Do you have any ideas in terms of what policy instrument would you recommend?
The problem is that we have the highest unemployment rate in the entire world. We also have the highest inequality, that Gini coefficient, that we
Sure.
are still the highest. And so if we do not come up with drastic measures, I mean, 1% growth when you have
Yes.
inflation going at around about 4% means that you're not growing. You're actually
Sure, in real terms, yeah.
In real terms,
Purchasing
yes.
power, yeah. Sorry,
yes.
I'm going to cut you. You're not giving me any policy recommendations. You're just reasserting the fact that we need higher growth levels. How?
Okay.
Well, Spoo says that we need to stimulate demand, particularly from the infrastructure perspective, which the government has been promising. You know what I mean? And I hear that. I support that view. You know, that we do need to see a little bit of government expenditure happening here for the right reasons.
Spoo?
Basically, see what we are in the same position that during the Great Depression people were in, that there were no jobs. Basically, that was what the Great Depression was about. And so what they did was to employ people. The government became the employer of last resort, and the main thing that they did, they went for infrastructure, for a massive infrastructure build. So that is how we will have to spend our way out of this rut.
So here's why. Let
me just finish off by saying during Thabo Mbeki's second term, he grew there were about 1 million jobs created, because what he was doing was that they went for this social infrastructure. They built schools, we built clinics, hospitals, That's how you grow. That's this infrastructure program that the government has been talking about all along will directly benefit those people who don't have the skills that the economy currently, the current economic structure needs. I mean, people are not educated enough, and so the construction gives them that chance. Gives them what we need is just to kickstart.
Okay, I agree with you 100%. I think we basically are coming to our economic package, Ubuntunomics economic package, and I love it. So I've got I've got some challenges and constraints, right? So I agree with you that, there is a need for public investment and public drive and public expenditure. And I do agree. That is particularly needed when we're talking about low-skilled labor forces who won't be able to leverage things such as broadband access. My broadband thing is based on what will be good for the young people who are educated graduates sitting at home with no jobs. So the other problem, though, is that we don't have a cooperation in terms of financing. So the National Treasury, maybe now with the new minister, things will change. But the National Treasury's view is always going to be that where do we get the funding? And I think that's where we need the Reserve Bank to close that loop. However, if we look at the current people who are in power in these institutions and the current leaning in policy, even in terms of responding to the pandemic, the best they could do was to offer a loan guarantee scheme of 200 billion. They didn't even finance yes, the Reserve Bank claims to have bought government bonds, but they failed at all in terms of sort of monetary financing of government response to the pandemic. And I agree. Definitely not in the context of the high level of corruption in terms of what we've seen with the PPE corruption scandals, etc. But I do believe that government, in terms of its public expenditure, cannot do it without some level of monetary financing from the Reserve Bank, so that we're not borrowing in dollars in order to invest in social infrastructure, which will only yield rands, and we still face the exchange rate risk. So I agree with you. It's all about social infrastructure. Government needs to ramp up in social. People are living in the most, terrifying and horrific living conditions, particularly the most poor South Africans. We need to do something about that. A national housing project is not out of reach, particularly if we can get, monetary financing on board in order to finance, because it's not going to be financed through market mechanisms or borrowing from the market, because it's not economic infrastructure. Secondly, we do need to deal with structural constraints which will open space for new entrants into the market. I think there's no way around that one. We definitely need to intervene there. And then I think also is the issue around providing some level of income support, particularly for the poorest. I don't think that it's escapable. Although as Ubuntunomics, we don't necessarily support the philosophy and the idea of a basic income grant. I do think that, if we did this interventions at all these levels, we would actually come out with a better response rather than a silver bullet approach of saying, let's income a basic income grant, or let's have a national social development fund, or let's have a national pension fund. These ideas, I think, are not going to take us anywhere.
Yeah, we are in agreement. That's why I said, it's our macroeconomic philosophy needs to change. That's where we get. I mean, just now, the governor, he says what we should be considering is lowering our targets, our inflation targets, going to 3%, as if there will be lower, that because he says that will lower our interest rates. So he still thinks along the lines. He's still confined. He confines himself on thinking on this inflation targeting. He won't even consider financing even government infrastructure.
I do want to close on one last point to say, the problem with inflation target and interest rate monetary policy is that it only works where people have incomes, because credit only goes where people have incomes.
If
If
people
people
have
have
no
no incomes,
incomes,
it's pointless decreasing the cost of borrowing because they're not going to be able to repay that borrowing. They don't have incomes. We're sitting with 50% of the labor force unemployed. We need new ideas. On that note, let's move on to our next story from the SA Update. Fashion police to promote local clothing. Proudly South African launched its own local fashion police project on all social media platforms to promote wearing of locally designed and manufactured clothing and accessories. The fashion police consists of local designers David Tlale, Bale Di Sahapo, Oma Tema, and Sandy Rogers, who will judge entrants who are invited to post pictures of themselves wearing a locally made outfit using the hashtag #WearLocalEveryday and tagging the designer. 4 lucky winners will each get 10,000 Rand to spend at one of the local designer studios and 1 night's accommodation in Johannesburg for fittings to winners from outside Gauteng. Sbu, you think this is something to be welcomed?
This is the most welcome initiatives here, I think, especially the focus on the consumer and the market side of the equation, the marketing side of the equation. South Africans have to leverage on their buying power, the little that we have, and potential spin-offs from that. No matter how small our industry seems, especially when you compare it to the massive global industry, which is worth 2.5 trillion dollars per annum. This is an industry that is highly sophisticated when you consider all the elements.
I agree with you. Zama, any thoughts?
Yes, I completely share the same sentiments. I love this initiative. I think that it's clear that not just from this, but it's actually the government's quite serious. It's a trend, and I see it happening, that it's focusing and it's investing in textiles and textile manufacturing. And I'm excited about this because, as Spu has mentioned and has alluded to, that this assists in propelling Africa into manufacturing productive capabilities, right? That could see it competing globally with larger players such as China, Bangladesh, India, and the likes. And I really love the point that he made on employing relatively low-skilled people. We really do need as much employment as possible. And the textile industry is such industry that could find, relatively low skill base to enter, and can definitely open up those employment opportunities.
Look, I must admit I agree with most of what you guys said, but I must play the devil's advocate. It's just that I've never seen any country restructure its industrial capacity through a social media campaign. So what I'm saying is we need industrial policy, guys. We need government to pass high tariffs against imported clothing. But I do agree, it's a great initiative. On that point, moving on to our last story for the SA update. ICASA plans for spectrum auction. The Independent Communications Authority of South Africa, ICASA, plans to propose a consent order with the High Court on the 15th of September to an order setting aside invitation for applications for high-demand spectrum licenses and for a license to operate a wireless open access network. The Minister of Communications and Digital Technologies has since committed to completing the broadcasting digital migration process and related processes within 5 months from September 2021. ICASA uses an auctioning method to allocate high-demand spectrum, which could take place by the end of January 2022, and the authority is willing to separate the auction from the licensing of the wide open access network. Zama, you had a point about this one.
Yes, I think that it is better that ICASA gave the consent in order to avoid lengthy litigation, as it states, because that does result in more tax money being spent, and often to fruitless reasons. But again, these sort of matters to me appear to remain quite politicized to quite a large extent, I think.
Yeah, I must agree with you. The big contention in the market is whether or not South Africa can run a wireless open access network or won't. And apparently, the only close example of a success is Mexico. And already there are concerns that they might not have reached all their targets in terms of the investment levels for the network infrastructure, etc. So yeah, but I do think that the approach that government's taking, ICASA is taking a very big compromise in this one by deciding to go ahead with the auction, or being willing at least to go ahead with the auctioning of the spectrum separate from the issue of the WOAN. Because obviously from the government's point of view, the WOAN is pretty much, I would say, a government trying to nationalize, in a way, through a public-private partnership, a certain portion of the sort of spectrum and the high-demand spectrum, in order to meet some of these socioeconomic demands, right? But I guess a large part of this is a missed opportunity in South Africa, because there's also been a large investment in terms of 5G infrastructure, but the auctioning of some of this spectrum has been hamstrung further development, because the rest of the globe's now on 7G, 9G, like their paces ahead. And there seems to also be very little interest in private investment in this WOAN. Smooth, what are your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I would say that we have to be happy that eventually, after having been promised for ages that the digital age might be upon us, it's been almost like more than a decade that they've been talking about this digital migration. Yeah, there's finally some light at the end of the tunnel. But getting back to what Zama was saying about politicizing, former Finance Minister Tito Mboweni didn't mince his words about the role of vested interest in the entire process, because there are big multinationals like the Naspers Group and communication giants like MTN and Vodacom. And on top of that, you've got global players. They're all chomping at the bit, trying to muscle their way in. And some have even suggested that let me use the word, the removal of former Minister Stella Ndabeni Abrahams had something to do with all of these shenanigans happening in the background. So I would say the auctioning method, like I've heard that the auctioning method is complex, and that ICASA has had to carefully consider things like drafting, empowering legislation, including law of administrative justice and procedural fairness. No, I mean, it is expected that contestation for the spectrum is going to be fierce. So as for other technical jargon like WOAN, I don't know what that means.
Okay, so let me try and quickly explain what is meant by WOAN. So the wireless open access network is going to be operated through a public-private partnership. So basically what it does is it adds a new layer between those who provide the service, which are basically the owners of the physical infrastructure, thinking here of Cell C, Vodacom, etc., all the telecoms players. And there are some new players also, such as Dark Fiber Africa, etc., in the various parts of the segment of the sector. And the idea is that those guys would then only be able to access the broader, so South African national network would be an open wireless network where people could access via private or via the WOAN. And the WOAN itself mediates the access from South Africa local into the rest of the world global network. And why government would want this is to actually control, obviously, traffic, but also to be able to be involved in terms of mitigating prices on consumers, as well as finding a way to attract further investment. And that's why they wanted to get a consortium of private players involved as well. And I think the problem is that the communications or telecom sector in South Africa hasn't necessarily proved itself or proved itself to have integrity in the past. Given what we've seen with the high excessive data costs, the high drop-off, call drop rates, etc., which are all being as a result of them manipulating market power and poor market conduct as well. So what I'm saying is, the reason why government wants to be involved is in order to ensure equitable access for all at low and reasonable prices. But obviously then government still has to attract the private players in order to invest in the actual physical infrastructure. On that note, that brings an end to the SA update this week. Moving on to the Africa regional update. Our first story is Guinea's weekend coup. The president of the African Union, His Excellency Felix Tshisekedi, and the chairman of the AU Commission, Moussa Faki Mohamed, condemned the ongoing political and security situation in the Republic of Guinea. This follows an apparent coup d'etat led by Lieutenant Colonel Mamadi Doumbouya and the arrest of President Alpha Conde. The AU heads also invited the AU Peace and Security Council to urgently meet to examine the situation in Guinea and take the appropriate measures in response. The military junta has assured economic and financial partners that activities in the country are continuing as normal, and the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS Authority of Heads of State and Government, convened on the 8th of September and agreed to call the immediate return to constitutional order and demanded the military maintain a constitutional posture, as well as suspended Guinea from all ECOWAS activities and dispatched a high-level ECOWAS mission to Guinea to assess the situation. Smoo, you had a view on this one. In fact, quite a criticism of what is going on.
It's more about the AU and the continent's inability to silence the guns and restore its own commitments, and that commitment not to recognize a regime change brought about through military coups. One wonders, it all was it not the Zimbabwean bloodless coup that we all celebrated, which in the same way as has happened in Guinea? Everyone was jolly happy that the dictator has fallen, and it was all sour grapes later as they came to realize. It has been said that up until 2019, there were at the most 2 military coups in Africa over the past decade, because but something has changed. And like I was saying, we've covered most of what has happened in West Africa about the inability and reluctance of ECOWAS to act on these military interventions. But I'm happy to hear that ECOWAS has called for the restoration of order and releasing of President Conte. I don't know, maybe am I connecting the dots properly, or are they aligning in your views here?
You certainly are more inclined for these conspiracies. I think, look, I do agree there have been a wave of coup d'etats, and actually I've been thinking that it's interesting the kind of role that militaries are now playing, or they seem to be playing. I don't think that the dots connect as clearly, but there's been a wave. Yes, it started with Zimbabwe, which was successful, but Mali, remember, actually is the one that led this, even before Zimbabwe. And in fact, the current coup that's happening in Mali now is the second one, I think, in a 3 or 4 year space. So these kinds of coups have been happening, and ironically, the military has played different roles at different times. So in some instances, for example, in Burkina Faso case prior to 2015, the military took over and actually is what led to Blaise Compaoré coming into power and pretty much running a patronage state where he was negotiating with terrorist groups in order to ensure safety of Burkina Faso from attacks, but negotiating their passage through the territory. And at the same time, you've got military playing a different role in Southern Africa. If you remember, a couple of weeks back, we covered the protests and the military action in Eswatini as a result of public protests there, where the military was actually protecting the regime of King Mswati. Whereas
Yes.
in the West African case with Guinea, and also what we've seen with Goita, at least in the first military coup that he was involved in, was that they were taking over the country from what they considered illegitimate rulers or rulers who have abused their power and had then promised to hand over power to civilian rule once things would come down. So in this case, and I think I will just answer your question, Zam, as to what's led to this coup. There's a 2020 constitutional referendum where current President Alpha Conde amended the term limits and also extended the presidential term from 5 to 6 years. So in a way, basically using this constitutional referendum to reset his already existing 2 terms, and was then re-elected for a third, the same playbook throughout the continent. Was re-elected for a third term in October 2020. So the opposition has been disgruntled with this. However, when the Constitutional Court in Guinea approved the election results, they were pretty much out of legal approaches to fighting what they saw as meddling and interference with the election. So yeah, I think the context is different in each case, Smoo, but we've seen a wave of these kinds of coups taking over, which actually links to the next story on the ECOWAS envoy to Mali. So the ECOWAS special envoy and mediator to Mali, led by the former president of Nigeria, Goodluck Jonathan, visited Mali from 5 to 6 September. The ECOWAS envoy paid a courtesy call to the president of the transition, Colonel Assimi Goita, and held a working session with the prime minister of the transition, Mr. Kugwel Maiga. The envoy congratulated the government for the relative calm observed in the country and noted the release of former president of the transition, His Excellency Ba Ndao, and the former prime minister, Mr. Mokhtar Owane. Despite the renewed expression of the transition authorities to respect the agreed deadline of the transition by the end of February 2022, the envoy has raised concerns about the lack of concrete action in the effective preparation for the electoral process. Zama, you had a simple, single-word response or comment on this one.
Scary. That's all I have to say. The envoy has raised concerns about the lack of concrete action in the effective preparation of the electoral process. Scary. Very,
very scary. Very scary. I do hope that Mali picks up the pieces. Obviously, they've been left with a precarious situation, particularly with the president of France, Emmanuel Macron's plan to pull out the French military from the Sahel, including Mali. Although he's kind of stepped back on some of those comments, particularly following the real botched exit of the US from Afghanistan, it still seems as though the Mali military will still continue to face challenges, particularly against the insurgency domestically, but also in terms of being able to defend its own borders. This military junta and the control of the military in the transitional government doesn't seem to be helping much, given the fact that itself, the military, doesn't have a monopoly on violence over the whole country. Leading on to our next story on meningitis outbreak in the DRC. A deadly outbreak of meningitis has been declared in northeastern Chopo province in the Democratic Republic of Congo, the DRC. More than 260 suspected cases and 129 deaths have been reported, demonstrating a high fatality ratio of 50%. So more than 100 patients are receiving treatment at home and in health centers in Banalia, which is the community affected by the outbreak. Meningitis is transmitted through the air by infected carriers and must be treated with antibiotics as soon as possible. Although people of all ages can catch the disease, it mainly affects babies, children, and young people. Major improvements have been made on vaccinations to treat the viral form of the disease, with more than 1.6 million people under the age of 30 being vaccinated during an extensive campaign in 2016 in Chopo province, which lies on the African meningitis belt that runs across the continent from Senegal all the way to Ethiopia, comprising of 26 countries. Zama, what do you think of this one?
Well, yeah, I think we need to place a greater emphasis on the health needs of specific countries, such as the DRC and Madagascar, as we discussed a couple of weeks ago. I mean, we recently just covered the bubonic plague outbreak in DRC, and now it's meningitis. I mean, I understand that the meningitis belt has about 26 countries, as you've mentioned, but it's all happening in the DRC at the moment. So I think that regard must be had to the health crisis crippling the country, because if the people continue to die, there'll be nobody left to save the land. And another point on this is that a health group was recently established that we covered. I believe it was the AMA and the MA Treaty, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
And I think these are the kinds of issues that these sorts of organizations need to focus on. And these are the sorts of countries that they need to be putting a, bird's eye view or laser focus on.
Definitely agree with you. And, it really hurts me, the kind of, pain and challenges that the DRC has. For me, unless we can resolve the many challenges facing the DRC and Central Africa generally in the Great Lakes region, we're never really going to be able to heal the continent, because it's almost like it's the heart and the arteries of. I think the challenges also in the DRC are just much more fundamental, and they point to developmental challenges. I mean, a large part of the illness and outbreaks that we've covered that are affecting the DRC have got a lot to do with simple hygiene. And to me, that speaks to a simple developmental fact of access to water and living conditions that people are in. And so, again, we're seeing that the problems of development on a continent are mutating into public health crises and problems. Similarly to the case when we discussed the conflict, that we're no longer seeing that conflict is constraining development, but that actually now the lack of development is leading to further conflicts, as what we've seen with Cabo Delgado in Mozambique, as what we've seen in northern parts of Cameroon as well as Nigeria, with insurgencies springing up from areas which had been neglected by policymaking and national central governments. So similarly, I'm seeing that the developmental crises and government not being able to access remote areas in the eastern parts of DRC in particular has led to a lot of outbreaks and pandemics. They already have the problem of the conflict as a result of these development challenges. So, yeah, it's quite dire, actually.
Yes, it is. It is.
On that note, that brings us to our last story for the Africa Regional Update: $426 million funding gap for Tigray. The World Food Programme, WFP, is facing an unprecedented funding gap of $426 million for its operation in Ethiopia, as the agency ramps up delivery to meet the needs of up to 12 million people this year. So far, the Tigray conflict has forced 300,000 people from their homes and 1.7 million into the neighboring provinces of Afar and Amhara. In the coordination with the Ethiopian government authorities, the WFP plans to reach 530,000 people in Afara and 250,000 people in Amhara, and the operation will scale up as need increases and funding is received. In Tigray, food security continues to worsen, and the WFP and its partners are struggling to scale up and meet the urgent food needs of 5.2 million people. Zama, you had a question or comment on this with respect to how the COVID situation is turning out.
Yes, I was saying that for me, it kind of makes sense that there would be a funding gap, with how COVID-19 is shaking up the global economic and health systems.
With you, I agree with that. I think, but I'm not sure obviously what the current context is in Tigray, but I'm pleasantly surprised to see that at least the flows on humanitarian assistance have been ongoing, rather than what we expected, that the conflict would resume, despite the fact that obviously this humanitarian ceasefire remains uncertain, and it will be interesting to see how things turn out. Sbu, what are your points on this one?
The only way to curb another humanitarian catastrophe in the highlands is for there to be a lasting ceasefire, just at least to allow for aid to reach these needy communities. These are agricultural communities, and Afar is a very dry place, and so they need. It's sparsely populated, but it's very dry. It's similar to Tigray. But back to my point, as pursuant to a ceasefire, negotiations can start and those should lead to a negotiated settlement, because this war is starting to drain the resources of that country, of Ethiopia, and will lead to even more distress and more widespread throughout the country.
On that note, that brings an end to our essay update this week. And that brings us to the numbers game. All right, so this week's number is 50 million rand. Smooth. What do you think?
50 million rand in South Africa.
Wow.
A grant for some boreholes.
Zama, what do you think this number has to do with?
Oh my gosh, 50 million rand. Oh my gosh, I don't know. You know, every time I hear such numbers, I just think lotto. You know, the kind of lotto drawery that's like the lotto draw that would make me happy in life. I can't even think what 50 million would be used for in South Africa right now. Tell me, please.
Okay, so it's 50 million rand fine against Viceroy. The Financial Sector Conduct Authority, FSCA, has imposed an administrative penalty of 50 million rand, which is approximately $3.5 million, against Viceroy Research Partners respondents Aidan Lau, Fraser John Perring, and Gabriel Bernard. The respondents were found to have contravened the Financial Sector Regulations Act and the Financial Markets Act by publishing false, misleading, or deceptive statements, premises, or forecasts regarding material facts in respect of Capitec Bank Holdings Limited, Capitec. As a result, Capitec's share price declined by 23.1%, and the bank lost 9.3 billion rand in market capitalization. The respondents allegedly gained financially from the decline in Capitec's share price by short selling the stock. This involves borrowing an amount of stock and selling it while the price is high, then buying the same amount of stock at a lower price to repay the broker and pocketing the profit. So there you have it. What are your thoughts on this one?
Level white collar crime, high level stuff. This is high level stuff.
I remember when this story broke out and Capitec Bank was at pains to defend its loan book and its practices around non-performing loans. The allegations were that they were rescheduling the loans and they had overextended themselves. I think it was something like 60 or 40% of their loans were non-performing, and it was just a terrible blast at Capitec. And Viceroy is known for similar conduct on other companies, and in fact apparently they were the ones that led to breaking of the Steinhoff story. Obviously the Steinhoff story now is history. The rest is history, that they also must have benefited similarly by shorting the Steinhoff stock, which eventually was wiped out off the market. I think my view is that this fine is hardly is not going to make much of an impact relative to the possible gains that they've made, but supposedly, according to the Financial Sector Conduct Authority's statement, they had calculated what these respondents would have benefited from shorting the stock, and the fine was in the similar type of order. It'd be interesting to see whether or not the JSE follows up, because this is also stock manipulation, which is illegal according to the stock exchange regulations. So yeah.
But when you look at the figures, I mean, the Capitec lost 9 billion and these guys are only fined 50 million rand. 9 billion compared to 50 million rand. I mean, these fines are, but anyway, there's nothing the regulator can do.
Yeah.
On that note, that brings an end to our episode this week.